I stand here at the grave of Johann Sebastian Bach, it seems inconceivable that it's been nearly 2.5 centuries since he lived and worked. His music has been a very important part of my life from the beginning, as early as I can remember. And even now, if I have a practice day and I have a choice in the matter, I'll go to his music first.
My name is James Buswell. As a musician, I have spent more hours exploring the music of Johann Sebastian Bach than that of any other composer. Please join me on a pilgrimage to the stations of Bach's life. These stations are more than just historic places in Germany. Each one is a place where Bach lived and worked, where he was inspired and frustrated, where his genius was nurtured, and where his music was born.
Johann Sebastian was born in 1685 into a family replete with musicians. In fact, almost all of his male cousins, nephews, uncles, grandfather, father, had all been musicians in one way or another.
It was in the town of Eisenach that he was born, a small town in the southwest corner of what is now the German Democratic Republic. And this town is dominated by the Wartburg Castle. In this castle, Martin Luther lived in exile to think and to pray and to begin to translate the Bible from Latin into German. In the center of Eisenach is the St. George Church. Martin Luther preached here in 1521, more than 150 years before Bach was born.
It was at this font in the St. George Church of Eisenach that Johann Sebastian was brought to be baptized. By the way, his first cousin once removed was playing the organ at the time. And if you think that that's rather complicated, you should try to grapple with the entire family tree of this extraordinary family. It's difficult not only because almost all of the male Bachs were indeed musicians of one sort or another, but almost all of them were named Johann. This was an exceedingly common name at the time, and literally all of Bach's brothers were so named, Johann. So it was by the second name that you knew them, and Bach would have gone by the name of Sebastian.
And so, on March 23rd, 1685, 2 days after his birth, Johann Sebastian's name was entered in the register of the St. George Church.
He practically had no choice but to become a professional musician. His father was one, his brothers, his uncles, and so forth. And I think he picked it up right there in his father's house. And his father was primarily a violinist, so we have to assume that he also taught him the basics of fiddle playing, and the foundation of his keyboard skills were taught to him by his brother Johann Christoph.
During Johann Sebastian's lifetime, 75 Bach family members were professional musicians. The Bachs maintained a tight family unit. They taught one another and performed together, bound by affection and the love of music. Bach's earliest biographer, Johann Forkel, recalled such occasions.
As it was impossible for them all to live in one place, they resolved to see each other at least once a year, and fixed a certain day upon which they all had to appear at an appointed place. Their amusements were entirely musical. It was a general custom to begin everything with religion. From this pious start, they proceeded to drolleries in great contrast. They sang popular folk songs whose contents were partly comic and partly vulgar.
Bach's father was also a Johann Ambrosius. He was well loved and respected as director of music in Eisenach. Among his responsibilities was the training of the Stadtpfeifers. Like all musicians in Germany, he lived and worked subject to the will of the reigning prince. Ambrosius once begged his duke to allow him to take a better job in Erfurt. The duke said no, and that settled the matter. Many years later, his son would get into deeper trouble in Weimar when he made a similar request. The Germany of Bach's time was very different from the Germany of today. In the 17th century, the nation was fragmented into dozens of privately ruled principalities like Prussia, Bavaria, Hanover, and Saxony. And even these often had several distinct rulers. The 30 Years' War had destroyed any semblance of national unity and caused terrible suffering. During this period, whole villages were wiped out, along with nearly 2/3 of the entire population. By the time Johann Sebastian Bach was born in Eisenach, the worst of the religious battles were already over. Both of Bach's parents died in the same year. In the winter of 1695, by the time he was 10, Johann Sebastian was an orphan. Fortunately, Bach did not have to face this crisis alone. He and his 13-year-old brother Jakob were taken in by their elder brother Christoph, who was the church organist in the small town of Ohrdruf.
I had death from a very early age in my family. And all around me, friends, all my youth. And I know it did something to me that other people don't have. And I feel very close to him, maybe for that reason too, that he had these experiences at an early age, how shaken he must have been. And that's why I think that the idea of death was with him from a very early age. And that's why I find him just as moving and great in his very early cantatas, if you talk about feelings and ways of expressing them, than in his mass. But of course, the technique and the style, the technique, all this improved a lot. He knew well what he wanted and how to say it. But the quality of his art and of his feeling, of his humanity, really, because that's what it is that's what it is that makes him so great to us, because he's more human than most anyone else.
Johann Sebastian was fortunate to have had his brother as a teacher. He emerged from this period a versatile young musician. He played all the keyboard instruments and even began to make repairs on church organs.